I want to go back in time today to February 2nd, 493 AD. Now, we're in Italy. And this is a particular joyous day because two barbarian kings had just signed a peace treaty with one another, the idea being that both of them would rule Italy, the Italian peninsula, what used to be sort of the Western Roman Empire, that they would rule this together. Of course, we call it the Western Roman Empire because since 313, more than a century and a half before, sort of the seat of power and wealth and military might and so forth in Rome, in ancient Rome, had moved east to Constantinople. And from that period on, and even before, the part in the west, where what we think of as Rome, still the Western Roman Empire, in Rome proper itself, was sort of an interminable series of crises, economic crises, depressions, recessions, revolutions, rebellions, invasions. I mean, it's just a horrible time to be there, dealing with, wage and price controls and people controls and constant, it's just constant warfare. I mean, it's a really horrible time to be there in Rome. Most historians count September 476 AD as the time when the actual Western Roman Empire fell. Of course, Rome went on to become sort of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire after that, and sort of lived on for centuries afterwards. And of course, the Byzantine Empire became maintained its wealth and power and prestige. The Byzantine gold solidus coin was one of the most widely used reserve currencies in the world. You could find Byzantine gold solidus coins as far away as China and in England and really all over the known world at the time, just as being used as a reserve currency. But back in the West, in Rome proper, it was a complete and total disaster. And in 476, Western Rome fell, and it was ruled by some of these sort of barbarians that came down, one of whom was named Flavius Odoacer. Flavius Odoacer was the king of Italy. He came to power in 476 and was ruling over Rome, the city of Rome, among the rest of Italy. And then this Ostrogoth guy came down. His name was Theodoric, known as Theodoric the Great. Theodoric came down into Ily about 12 years after Odoacer came to power. In 488, Theodoric shows up with his army. Now remember, the Ostrogoths, a lot of historians think that they originally come from southern Sweden, through Germany, and they were kind of heading south and waging war and plundering and so forth along the way. And Odoacer came into Italy in 488 and immediately started fighting. He took Verona, he took Ade, he took Ravenna. And finally, they said, okay, enough is enough. 5 years into this, on February 2nd, 493, these two kings, Theodoric of the Ostrogoths and Odoacer, the king of Italy, signed this treaty. And they said, okay, we'll split the rule. We'll rule Italy together. And this is something that was really welcome. People were really happy about this because they were just sick and tired of warfare, the fighting and the bloodshed and the constant emergency. Everything's an emergency all the time. It's always an emergency in Italy, and everybody has to react, and there's not enough food and there's not enough money, and they're just sick and tired of it. And so now they've got two kings who sit down and say, you know what, we're going to have a peace and we're going to rule together and everything's going to be okay. And people were happy about that. They were so happy, actually, that they organized a celebration to commemorate the signing of the peace. And as part of that celebration, they held a huge banquet. And it was at that banquet that the two kings and their people, their courts and their staff and so forth, got together and slapped each other on the back and shook hands and toasted one another. And Theodoric raises his glass, and they have a toast to each other, to peace. Who knows what they're actually toasting to. And he puts his glass down, and then he goes and he kills the guy that he just signed the peace treaty with. He killed Odoacer with his own bare hands and his own sword. I mean, this is something that this is just right out of Game of Thrones. And it's stuff that, today makes really good television. Back then it was reality. That's really how people lived. And in doing so, Theodoric really consolidated all the power over Italy for himself. So now he was the sole ruler, the sole king of Italy. And he sort of viewed himself as the guy who had this golden opportunity to resurrect the greatness of the Western Roman Empire. He wanted to make Rome as great as it once was. And so, of course, how did he plan on going about doing that? By waging war. All the stuff that people were sick and tired of. He wanted to go back across Italy. He wanted to go into Dalmatia, which we would call sort of modern-day Croatia, essentially across the Adriatic and into some of these different areas, into Slovenia and the Balkans and so forth, and take these places back and really try and resurrect some of the greatness of Western Rome. Of course, there's just one problem with that. Well, there's probably a lot of problems with that, but one of the biggest problems is that war is very expensive. It costs a lot of money, and they didn't have any. They didn't have any because the empire, the Western Roman Empire, Rome itself, its economy had just been ravaged. There was hardly any money to be found. There was very little prosperity. There's very little production. I mean, this is what happens when people impose wage and price controls. I'm going all the way back to the Edict of Diocletian. When there's really bad times, people, particularly productive folks, they take their capital, they take their savings, they take everything they can, their portable wealth, they get up and they go, and they take their talent with them, they take their productivity with them, they take their wealth with them, and they move somewhere else. And this is, people were heading off to Constantinople, they were heading off to other parts of Europe, anywhere they could find to get away from all the constant chaos and emergency and the economic, the complete lack of prosperity in Rome. And so they didn't have any money. And Theodoric knew it, and so he resorted to something. It certainly wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last time in history he resorted to this old play. And again, we talk about this a lot, is that bankrupt governments have a very limited playbook. And it's a time-tested, very traditional playbook that, it's almost like there's some little text being passed around from bankrupt government to bankrupt government for thousands of years now. And that is to plunder your own citizens. And there's a particular pecking order in which you plunder your own citizens. Because it doesn't really matter what form of government you have, whether you have some totalitarian communist state, or you have, some other form of, whether it's a sort of a religious theocracy or something masquerading as a representative democracy or republic or anything else. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, at a certain level, you have to keep your stakeholders happy. And who are the stakeholders? The stakeholders are the people. People have a breaking point. It doesn't matter what form of government you have. History is very clear on this point, is that every single person alive has a breaking point. Civilizations, societies have a breaking point. People are willing to go so far, they're only willing to put up with so much sort of negative, bad consequences of pitiful decision-making. They have a breaking point. We saw this in France in 1789. For years and years, decades really, they had been, they cheered when Louis XIV died. I mean, that had been decades before the beginning of the French Revolution. And they had been suffering from a total lack of prosperity, lack of economic opportunity, a decline in their standard of living. People were starting to starve. They had another bad harvest in the winter of 1788. And going into 1789, and suddenly, boom, that was it. They hit their breaking point. And an entire society really went into revolution. This is something that history tells us over and over and over again. Everyone has a breaking point. People living under the Soviet Empire had a breaking point. People living really in any society, the most totalitarian state we can imagine, everybody has a breaking point. And so at some point you have to sort of at least pacify some level of a majority of your people at some point. As they say, I believe Lincoln once said, even, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And so you have to sort of pacify some of your population. And doing so, if you have to resort to plundering your citizens and plundering your population, there's a pecking order. You don't want to go after the majority of the people, or as we would call in a sort of a democratic republic or representative democracy, you wouldn't go after your biggest constituency. You wouldn't go after the largest voting population. You don't go after, for example, your retirees, because everybody knows those guys get out and vote. So if you have to sort of screw somebody, you got to go find another segment of the constituency to screw. So who do you screw? Well, what we figure out pretty quickly is the dead people don't vote. That's a long, time-tested, traditional tactic in the old playbook of bankrupt governments. Dead people don't vote. And it was a pagan custom leading up to this. We can go all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks. Remember, they used to put to pay the toll going into I believe it was the river Styx, to pay the toll in the afterlife. They would put coins, they would bury the dead with. This was an old, long-standing pagan ritual. Whenever people would die, they would sort of bury them with some level of wealth, whether it was to pay the toll or to ensure that they had some wealth in the afterlife. This is a long-standing pagan custom. And Theodoric knew it. Of course, he was an Ostrogoth, he knew it. But he knew that sort of in the tombs and in the crypts and so forth, across Rome, across Italy in general, that there was an untold, incalculable amount of wealth down there. There were all kinds of gold and silver coins that had been sort of, on deposit with all these people that have been long since dead. And Theodoric said that it was a crime to leave hidden among the dead and useless what would keep the living alive. And so he decreed that people should go down and essentially grab all the gold and silver, and that all that gold and silver should be turned over, of course, to the state. That it should be turned into coin and being used for public benefit. Of course, it's for the people. Of course, public benefit in this case was to go out and wage war and advance combat and plunder and so forth, which is obviously similar to what we have today. Dead people don't vote. I would include in dead people, we talked about this before. Dead people means, in this case, people who pass away and leave on assets. And so since dead people don't vote, let's go and seize the assets of those who pass away. This is what we talked about in a Notes from the Field article recently about estate planning. They know that dead people don't vote, and so it's the easiest thing in the world for them to go and tax the estates of people that have just passed away. And we see this around the world. With headline estate tax rates, as high as 40%, 50% plus. We see this in even states in the land of the free, in Pennsylvania and Tennessee and so forth, where, if you leave any assets in the state above zero, that individual state is going to try and tax it. Because again, dead people don't vote. This also applies, more importantly, to the unborn. Unborn, generations of people that won't even be born still for years, for decades, who won't even reach voting age for decades and decades beyond. It's just somebody who's born a couple of years from now won't reach voting age for 2 decades and might not even necessarily be sort of with it and aware of the issues for another decade beyond that. So that's a pretty easy constituency to completely screw. Because the decisions that certain administrations make now, or a few years ago, or a few years from now, the consequences that will be felt by future voters sort of won't be realized for decades. And many of those people that are in power now, they might even be dead themselves. They'll be long since retired, and nobody's really going to blame them anymore. They'll blame whoever happens to be in power 2 or 3 decades from now. So it's a really easy constituency for people to screw. And as this case of Theodoric the Great shows, it goes back thousands of years for people. It's that old playbook of bankrupt governments. Let's go screw dead people. Let's go screw the unborn. And this is something that has been very popular throughout history. How do you steal from unborn people? Well, it's quite easy. You rack up a whole lot of debt. If you rack up debt today, essentially represents bringing forward from the future whatever your taxation, whatever your tax revenue in the future is supposed to be, you bring that into today. So what they're essentially doing by going into debt, they're borrowing from the future. And of course, then they have to pay that down with tax revenue that they would generate from people who are going to be born now and enter the workforce and so forth 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So that's really all they're doing is they're taking, when we pay taxes, the idea behind paying taxes is that we pay for some supposed service that the government provides. Of course, people always want to list all these services that, for whatever reason, people think that only the government can provide. Of course, our favorite is always the roads, because we didn't have governments. Who would build the roads? As if there's no private roads out there, as if there's no tollways, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the whole idea, is that we pay taxes and we're supposed to be able to derive some level of benefit from our taxes. We're supposed to be able to derive some sort of immediate or at least short term. We get some defense, security. We get people who wear guns on their hips and molest us at airports to protect us from men in caves who hate us from our freedom. That we buy drones and bombs and so forth. That, this is sort of the, quote, benefit that we get, but at least it's some sort of immediate impact. What's happening now is that they're borrowing from these kids in the future, people that won't even be born for years, who are going to be paying interest on debts that accumulate today. So essentially, we get to consume today. We get to buy more bombs and more drones and more wars today. And who gets to pay for it? People in the future. So they derive absolutely no benefit for it. The benefit, sort of the consumption of this debt, takes place today. The payment for the debt takes place in the future. And that's a great way to rob somebody without them even knowing it, is that the people that are born today in most places across the West, whether you're in France or Belgium or Italy or Japan, or of course the land of the free, you are born into an invisible bondage that's known as debt, because you are now obligated. Before, you didn't sign up for this, you didn't agree to it, you didn't sign a piece of paper that said, yea, I verily agree to pay off this debt, but simply by virtue of being born, by accident of birth, on a piece of soil, on a piece of dirt, or to parents that happen to be born on a piece of dirt, you are now obliged by law to spend your entire working life, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not, paying down debts that you never signed up for ever and will receive no benefit from whatsoever, ever. And that's the situation that people will be born into for the next, really in the coming decades. This was made abundantly clear by the most recent budget proposal that was put forth by the administration. Of course, we love to cover this stuff because it really shows. This is what, we talk about this stuff a lot when we say, for example, that these countries are bankrupt. I use this word a lot, bankrupt, or my preferred word really is insolvent. And what I always tell people is, I say, look, guys, this isn't me. This isn't Simon Black's wild and crazy conjecture. This isn't me trying to be sensational and, oh, look, everybody, these guys are bankrupt. It's not even based on my own very methodical and calculated analysis. They themselves are telling us that they're bankrupt. Their own numbers are telling us that they're bankrupt. And I want to just sort of illustrate this to you very, very clearly. I am looking directly on page 95. I guess this is from the budget itself. This is page 95 in the PDF, page 91 in the budget. I'm just looking at table S1 in the budget totals. In 2014, this was obviously just in the last year here, they raised about $3 trillion in tax revenue. Actually, this is really in total receipts, and so the actual tax revenue itself was less than that. But we'll just call it $3 trillion in tax revenue. And of that $3 trillion in tax revenue, now we look at what they're sort of proposing for the budget. Well, it's quite simple. They are proposing a total of $2,548 billion just on mandatory entitlement spending. Now, mandatory programs are things that are just that, right? This isn't optional. There's no discretion in Congress about whether or not this stuff gets paid. We're talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, certain mandatory retirement programs, for example. These are things that are required, literally required by law. The analogy that I make is like a lot of people, they have, for your mortgage, if you're paying a mortgage on your home, a lot of people have some like sort of direct auto draft set up. So you don't actually even have to write a check for it. You don't have to get together with your spouse and say, gee, should we pay our mortgage this month? It just gets sucked out of your bank account automatically every single month. Maybe your car loan is like this, or if you have a student loan, or all the debts that we like to have in the West. A lot of people have this stuff just sort of auto drafted, pulled directly out of their bank account. They don't have to write a check. They don't have to make a decision. They don't have to make a phone call. It just gets taken out of their account. That's what Social Security really is. Congress doesn't get together to vote. They don't have to argue or bicker or make any decision whatsoever. They don't have to write a check. It just gets sucked out of the bank account and gets paid to all the people in the system who are entitled to receive Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or disability or any of these mandatory, retirement programs and so forth. All these are automatic. So they're spending up to $2,548 billion that they're proposing in the budget. That's a lot of money. Now, the other thing is that's absolutely mandatory is interest on the debt. Now, they fudge it a little bit here. They only use what they call net interest. And the reason they use a term called net interest is because it goes back to that old song that we love to talk about that government and, of course, people in general now sort of believe that the debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. Okay, so the fact that sort of this quote, we owe it to ourselves, this is derived from this, this notion that the majority of debt in the land of the free, U.S. government, federal debt, treasuries are owned by, for example, Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Funds and the Federal Reserve and so on and so forth, or in certain cases even a couple of different departments of government and so forth. And so the idea is they're saying, well, we don't have to count that debt because we owe it to ourselves. We don't count debt held by, all the treasuries that are held by Social Security. All they count is debt held by, quote, the public. And this is such a lie. It's just a total blatant misrepresentation, because they say, oh, well, we don't count this debt that's held by Social Security because it's not held by the public. It's this sort of special issuance of debt that's only held by Social Security. It isn't traded. It's not marketable. It's not out there. You can't buy it. The only people that can hold it are these Social Security and Medicare trust funds. And so because of that, we don't count it because it's not held by the, quote, public. And I look at that and I say, what a completely disingenuous statement. I'm sorry, but who are the ultimate beneficiaries of Social Security? People of the United States, the U.S. taxpayer. That is, by definition, the public. And so if the ultimate beneficiaries of these funds are the public, how is it that the securities that are held by these funds, the funds are just sort of financial custodians that are holding these funds on behalf of the public? Ipso facto, this is debt that's held by the public. The most public debt, I would argue, is being held by these trust funds, but they don't count it. And because they count all this stuff, they say, oh, well, it's all internal to government, so we won't count that interest that's paid on the debt either. Again, I'm sorry, but interest that's owed to the public of the United States counts. It counts. It probably counts even more than interest that has to be paid to China or Japan or these countries, these oil exporting nations in the Middle East. This is interest income that is owed to the people of the United States. It counts. And to say that it doesn't count is intellectually dishonest, and it's a lie. It's a blatant misrepresentation of the truth. If you look at the debt level in the United States, it now stands at $18 trillion. If you take just the basic, sort of the average interest rate, again, this isn't even my calculation. This is, again, you can look at the Bureau of Public Debt. They'll tell you the debt that's held to the penny. I'll tell you that right now. Let's see, hold on, debt to the penny. I go to this website very frequently because I like to keep in touch with our friends in the Treasury and find out exactly how much the debt is. And as of the close of business, let's see, they do it as of February 2nd. I think that was Groundhog Day. How ironic. $18,099,442,237,253.89. This is all publicly available data. Anybody who knows how to use Firefox and has ever heard of this little website called Google can find this information out in about 3 seconds. So if you take this, and again, they also have on here the average interest rate. I'm just going to click here and tell you the average interest rate that they're posting. This goes as of December 2014. The average interest rate that they're showing is roughly 2.4%. Total interest-bearing debt, 2.369%. So if you add that together, if you take if you sort of take an average of what sort of the average interest rate that they're paying right now on their debt. And of course, they're telling you, we don't have to guess. We don't have to calculate it. We don't have to run some complex financial model. All we have to do is just look and see what the average debt is. The Bureau of Public Debt is telling us. And if we take that times essentially times the level of debt that the U.S. has right now, it's well over $400 billion. If we add that to the well over $2.5 trillion that they're spending just on these mandatory entitlement programs, what we see is that the total of that is just shy of $3 trillion. Now, bear in mind, I'll go back to the table that I mentioned earlier here on table S1. In 2014, they pulled in roughly $3 trillion of tax revenue. Their proposed budget shows that they want to spend $3 trillion just on mandatory entitlement programs and interest on the debt. Now, of course, they're not calculating that as interest on the debt. They're showing a much lower number as interest on the debt because they're being they're being highly, disingenuous about this, because they pretend that, the interest that's paid to you and I, to people who are owed this money, that it doesn't count. I would argue that it does count. And we can do a very simple calculation and see, okay, there's $18+ trillion in debt. We know what the interest rate is. If I multiply the average interest rate times the debt, that's how much money is paid out in interest. And of course, the Bureau of Public Debt shows us how much interest has been paid out last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. And of course, that number, that's on a highly upward trend as the amount of money that the U.S. government has to pay out in interest. If we add the two together, we see that the total is roughly as much as they collected in all of 2014 tax revenue. So essentially, all of 2014's tax revenue now is being squandered just on mandatory entitlement programs and interest. So before they write a check for anything that we think of as government, before they write a check for the light bill at the White House or President Obama's fuel in his jet, or the FBI, or even the Internal Revenue Service, or the Homeland Security, or even the military, they've blown through all of the money they collected last year in tax revenue. Every single penny is gone before they pay for anything that we think of as government. Now, of course, their solution, and they go out and they make these grandiose predictions about how much money they're going to collect in tax revenue all the way out through 2025. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy it. They claim, for example, that they're going to take in about $5.5 trillion in tax revenue in 2025. If there's one organization that has consistently failed time and time again to make accurate predictions, it is the United States government. We can go back to if you go back in time and look at some of the budget proposals they made 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when they looked out 5, 10, 15 years and so forth, they're utterly hilarious because, of course, they never really take into account anything that might actually, throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in this whole system. For example, looking out, through 2025. Here's the interesting thing: is that the Obama administration has released this budget, and they're saying, we think we're gonna, we recognize that we're still going to be, running deficits, but they're going to be sort of stable deficits, through 2025, and they think that that's actually a victory. They think that if they can just sort of stabilize the amount of money that they're losing, i.e. the amount of money that they're stealing from unborn children, from people that won't even be born for decades, if they can just minimize the amount of money that they're stealing from those people, or at least stabilize it, then they view that as a victory. If they're only losing, $687 billion a year, they think that's okay. They view that as a victory. And that sort of tells you a lot about their mentality. Economics is not really so hard. We award these guys, our most esteemed prizes for intellectual achievement, guys like Paul Krugman, who tell us that we just need, our solution to everything is just to conjure more money out of thin air. That's the path to prosperity. It's not really so hard. I mean, at the end of the day, these things are really quite simple. To lift people into prosperity, to generate a prosperous society, requires that an entire society produces more than it consumes. That's the basic law of economics. People that want to, grow themselves, to become wealthy and stable and so forth is really quite simple. Produce more than you consume. Spend less money than you earn. Build up a pool of savings. That's how individuals, you're not necessarily going to save your way to becoming a multi-billionaire, but you can certainly save your way into some level of prosperity. Because once you have savings, then you can invest that savings. You can afford to take some risk. You can afford to maybe start a business. You can afford to invest in certain things that can generate even more savings for you. This is the time-tested way to really build some level of prosperity. Produce more than you consume. Build a pool of savings. When an entire society does that, then an entire standard of living increases across the board. The other thing that makes that work is improvements and advances in technology. I would argue that in many cases in the West, sort of our, technology is very interesting because there's a lot of technology that's advancing very rapidly. I would submit, and this is really an entirely different point altogether, but I would submit that an unfortunate proportion of the technology, advances in technology are really being advanced towards consumer technology. Yes, we have nicer TV screens, we have more advanced resolution, we have smaller and more powerful mobile phones, and so on and so forth, and that's all great. But it's not, it's not exactly the flying cars that we were promised. But more importantly, it's something that doesn't necessarily advance all of humanity. It's sort of nice stuff to have. Phones and iPads and all that sort of thing. But again, it's all consumer technology. There's really almost unhealthy proportion of this, of brilliant minds and so forth that aren't really going to cure diseases and fix a lot of things, all these big problems that are out there. Really quite a bit of the sort of share of technology is being really focused on consumer technology. But that's a sort of a different thing altogether. And surely technology and this pool of savings is what makes an economy great. And they're sort of just continuing to, to build up $600-700 billion deficits, and they think that's okay. They've completely abandoned the basic principle that building up a pool of savings is what makes economies thrive, is what makes societies prosper. And they just don't care. It's very completely unapologetic to say, well, this is what it is, and we think that's a victory. And again, when you look at this and they're saying, we're now going to be spending literally 100%, 99.9% of all the tax revenue that we collected last year just on this mandatory stuff that we have to pay before we write a check for anything that we think of as government, and it's all gone. And that's the situation. They get by with two essential, let's call it two misrepresentations. Lie is a strong word. I'm sure they probably believe that in 2025 they'll be collecting $5.5 trillion in tax revenue, but their track record just doesn't bear out. Their track record is utterly pitiful. The only organization out there that has an even worse track record for prediction is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve makes these predictions, say next year we're going to have this kind of economy, and they're always wrong. And to say they're always wrong isn't an overstatement. They're literally always wrong. I was having this great conversation with Jim Rickards recently about this, and he says that the Fed has the worst track record of any. And if any private company had a track record as bad as the Fed, everybody would be fired, and the company would be out of business. So the government gets by making these ridiculous assertions and predictions. I should point out, by the way, that governmental accounting is in of itself its own beast. If you and I ran a business and kept our books the way the government does, we would be turning big rocks into little rocks. We would be wearing day-glow orange jumpsuits, and hanging out with guys that are in prison for mass murder. We would be in jail like any other criminal because it's illegal for private citizens and private businesses to conduct their own accounting the way that the government does it. And the government even knows this. In fact, we published the text of a resolution in the House of Representatives last week. I think it was last Friday. And one of the things that they basically said in here was that governments, whether state, local, federal governments, pension plans, and so forth, have, quote, understated liabilities and overstated asset growth rates and have employed methodologies that private sector plans are prohibited from using by federal law. The government is basically admitting, yeah, we can do this stuff that you can't do. And, we're the guys who make the laws. And so we're allowing ourselves the right to do these things that you can't do. And if you try and do it, it's illegal. And we're going to throw your asses in jail. Okay, so this is how they get by with these budget proposals. They make these absurd, assertions. They say, oh, we're going to have X number of trillions of dollars in revenue. And they're almost always wrong. And yet what we do know, they can't really make any predictions realistically about how much revenue they're going to have down the road. But what we can do is make pretty damn good predictions about how much these costs are going to be. And we went through this, I guess about a month and a half ago, and I put together my own financial model to basically look at this and say, okay, how if we start manipulating some of these variables, how does this actually look? Is it possible for the U.S. to pay down its debt? And the answer is no. They've really gone past the point of no return. I've satisfied that to myself mathematically, and we put this out a couple of podcasts ago. And we know what some of these costs are because, again, we know exactly what the debt level is. We can look at that. We can calculate that. And that's just sort of the official debt. It doesn't even factor in unfunded liabilities and so forth, which, again, you and I would have to keep on our books. The government doesn't have to admit this in its own financial statements. The other thing that we know is we know what the average interest rates are. We can sort of use the sensitivity analysis and ratchet those interest rates up or down and see what happens based on the direction that interest rates go. And I did that a couple of podcasts ago. The other thing that we can see for sure is sort of what these mandatory entitlement programs are going to be and how expensive they're going to be. We know exactly, we can go back and look at census records. We can find out exactly how many people were born in 1949, in 1950, in 1951, and so forth. And we can run the actuarial tables and see how many of them are actually going to start receiving Social Security and what the net outflow, the additional increases to outflow are going to be. All this is publicly available data. So we can sort of nail the costs down pretty hard. And get firm numbers on this. And again, we can just even look at what we did last year, or even what they themselves are budgeting for these costs, knowing that they notoriously understate the costs and overstate the revenues. And what we can see essentially is that these guys are in absolutely pitiful condition. And even with their own, what I would argue are wildly optimistic numbers, they're still running $700 billion deficits. And they think it's okay. And these $700 billion deficits, again, these are optimistic scenarios that don't take into account, war, recession, depression, emergency. And of course, I'm sure none of us could possibly imagine that over the next 10 years, there could ever be another war waged by the United States of America. Of course, they would never do that. They would never go to war. They would never invade another nation. They'd never drop bombs by remote control. They would never send their military in somewhere. Of course, that would never happen. Right? Of course, there could never be some kind of urgency in the financial system. Of course, that could never happen. That's never happened before, and it's never going to happen. And then you look at it and go, oh, wait a minute. All this stuff has happened even over the last couple of years. We've seen major crises in the financial system. We've seen governments go bankrupt, even within the land of the free. We've seen this happen. We've seen, endless warfare. And how much that's really cost the country, how much that's cost the Treasury, and so forth. And they assign a 0% probability to any of this. They assign, more importantly, a 0% probability to the US dollar losing any of its market share. There's a 0% probability over the next 10 years. And that's something that, I believe is completely, we could say it's intellectually dishonest, or we could say it's just completely out of touch with reality. Because as I tell you this right now, the Chinese renminbi is now the 5th most popular currency in the world, according to the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. This is the organization that sits at the core of all worldwide, wire transactions and so forth. They know exactly, they have all the data. And they put out a list essentially every month. And this is, the renminbi wasn't even on the list. It wasn't anywhere near, the top 10, the top 20, just in our own recent history. And now it's number 5. And it's growing. And China keeps signing these bilateral currency swaps, and they're pushing for their own development bank, and now they're going out and they're giving aid to nations across Southeast Asia, and all these sorts of things that you would sort of expect of big superpowers. They're out there doing it right now. And yet the United States of America, the government assigns a 0% probability that this might happen. And you can tell this because they just sort of continue with this assumption that they can continue to just sort of finance their deficit. They'll have no problem continuing to go deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And they see absolutely no problem with this whatsoever. And I think this is incredibly foolish. Again, none of this stuff happens overnight. Rome didn't fall overnight. The Western Roman Empire, it's not like everything was just fine and dandy all of a sudden, and then one day, Odoacer shows up and demands the throne. This is something that happened over a very long period of time. And it became pretty obvious what was happening even a century and a half before. Now, the world moves a hell of a lot faster these days, again, thanks in part to all this consumer technology. All of our social networking and our, and all these things, that are out there mean that things move, information moves a hell of a lot faster. Everything in general moves a hell of a lot faster. And so just like anything, it doesn't happen overnight. It'll happen gradually over time and then very suddenly. And we can look at this and just sort of see that the trend is only getting worse. And this isn't my, this isn't my prediction. This isn't my analysis. This is just as me as a literate human being. It's just, if you know how to read and you understand numbers, you can look at this and see that the trend gets worse and worse and worse. And that, these debt numbers, deficit numbers, in the future are far worse than they are today. That the debt continues to increase. And they have these wild, optimistic projections about tax revenue, about where the economy is going and so forth, assigning a 0% probability that there might be, maybe, just maybe, there might be a financial crisis. In 2007, 2008, when suddenly they had to start dumping an absurd amount of money, what Hank Paulson, the head Treasury Secretary at the time, called his bazooka. Nobody saw that coming 10 years before. It's not like, when Bill Clinton was still in power and his budget team got together and said, okay, we need to make these predictions 10 years from now. Nobody saw an epic meltdown in the financial system. They didn't have a $700, $800 billion bailout package programmed into the budget, That falls under the shit happens category, and it happens all of a sudden. Nobody predicts this stuff. It just sort of happens, and yet it happens. That's the whole point. It happens. They didn't see 9/11 coming. They didn't see this constant warfare, and yet it happens, and it seems to always happen. Wherever America goes, trouble follows. And that's the lot in life for somebody that's become the greatest debtor in the history of the world. You have to expect there's going to be trouble. When your entire banking system is extraordinarily illiquid, when your government is insolvent, when your central bank is nearly insolvent, that is not a consequence-free environment. And for them to think that there's a 0% probability that anything bad's going to happen, that they might have to bail out the financial system again, it's just utterly absurd. It's this Pollyanna thinking that everything's going to be all good and, the unicorns are going to come out and the sunshine, it's all going to be great. We're all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya around the campfire. It's just really utterly absurd thinking. And so what happens really is that these sort of crises, come up and they're going to get to a certain point where, the renminbi starts taking more of a market share. They got to come up with more money. They have to do what Theodoric did. Theodoric looks around and says, man, we are broke. And what are we going to do? Hey, there's all those dead people down below us that have a lot of money. Let's go steal from dead people. And they're going to get to this point. What are they going to do? They're going to start, picking off, everybody that they can find. They're going to continue to raise this debt because that steals from the unborn. They're probably going to raise these estate taxes because that steals from the dead. And then they're going to start going after some of these other pools of savings. And we've talked about this before, and we'll continue to talk about it. One of the biggest pools of savings out there are individual retirement accounts. In the United States, the IRS itself estimates that there's several $1 trillion sitting in individual retirement accounts. Now, the government itself is presuming that there's going to be, let's see, what do they have here? Debt held by the public. They're going to have 25 to $30 trillion in total debt. The debt held by the public, they think, is going to be $20 trillion. This doesn't even begin to consider all the funds that are owned by, the stuff that they don't count as being held by the public, all these non-marketable securities and so forth. If you factor that in, you're talking at least 25 to $30 trillion in debt. It's held by, that's owed by the United States government. Of course, if it's owed by the government, it's owed by the people of the United States. Now, they're going to have to get that money from somewhere. And again, when there's trillions of dollars sitting in retirement accounts, that's a great place to go and get money. We've talked about that before. They could very easily set up, an executive order to say all, 50%, 20%, 70%, whatever it is of all retirement accounts that are held by these big banks. They're acting as custodians, all the big names, the big names. These guys are going to have to start parking a portion of their the retirement funds that they hold in their management in the safety and security of U.S. Treasuries. And of course, they're going down this road now. This Myra program, they launched it. We talked about this last time. That was step one. Step two was this blitzkrieg promotional campaign to pump everybody up and, what they said, aggressively going after businesses to get them to sign people up. That was step two. Step three was in this most recent tax proposal to actually mandate that every small business with a small threshold of employees has to sign up. Every single person in an IRA program. And of course, what easier option than the government option, well, where you can set this up where you can loan your own money to the federal government. That's step 3. Step 4's already come. I mean, it was just a week ago we said, hey, step 3's already here. I said, how many more steps does it have to take before people realize what's happening? Well, here's another step, step 4. We'll talk about this more, but now now they've got language where they're talking about going after self-directed IRA structures. This is the structure that people, that one of the only structures people would actually take back their retirement savings and exercise tremendous influence over where their retirement savings is. You can take your retirement savings in a self-directed structure and ship it overseas and buy, foreign real estate with it. You could buy, just stick it in an offshore bank account. You could buy all kinds of things with it, subject to certain restrictions, what they call prohibited transactions, with that the Internal Revenue Service certainly wants to ensure everybody knows about. We do our best to try and educate people on those. But you have a lot of options to move your retirement savings away from a bankrupt government. And now they're trying to attack those structures. I highly doubt that they would sort of disallow those retroactively. It'd be very, very hard to do that. Just logistically, almost impossible, because you can imagine if somebody's sitting there holding an illiquid asset like foreign real estate through their self-directed IRA, you can't exactly force somebody to liquidate something that isn't liquid. So they can't really unwind past structures, but they can certainly disallow new structures. And this is something that I look at and I go, well, that's very concerning, because they're basically taking the one structure that can liberate people's retirement savings from a bankrupt government. They're saying, oh, well, we have to protect retirees, from these structures, because they could make a misstep somewhere, and so we have to protect people. And so we're looking pretty hard at regulating these and putting all kinds of restrictions on these and so on and so forth. This is something that's very concerning. I think everybody should be paying attention to here. Again, these are old tactics of every bankrupt government in history. They're always going to go down the pecking order. They're going to go after the unborn. They're going to go after the dead. They're going to go after anybody that doesn't really vote. Expatriates, Chinese, people, all Chinese government that owns, $2 trillion worth of debt. Those guys don't vote. And they're going to get to a certain point where they're going to have to say, okay, what's the biggest pool of savings that we can tap? Retirement accounts. And this is, all of these things are really in danger. I think anybody that's really paying attention, I'm not trying to wave my hands and jump up and down and say, the end of the world is nigh or anything like that. What I am saying is that if you take a very rational look at all of this using publicly available data, a basic, literate, intelligent person can look at publicly available data and see that the trend here is concerning and that there are a lot of risks out there. The risks, this is not a consequence-free environment. The risk of seeing that you're, this is a certainty. This is one thing that I will say, is that in their own prediction shows that tax revenues are going up. Okay, great. Yeah, of course, tax revenues should be going up. There's inflation, and there's going to be more of a population and so forth. So we would obviously expect that in 2025, the government tax revenue is going to be higher than it is in 2014. Obviously, there's going to be tens of millions of more people in the land of the free. There's going to be inflation. There's going to be all kinds of things. But, it's kind of interesting because they have one of these tables where they adjust it based on population and inflation, even using their own sort of monkey numbers. But what's very interesting here is that their own data, their own analysis shows, really proves that taxes are going to be a larger and larger part of your life in the future. Now, whether they're actually successful in deriving more tax revenue, I would say that really comes into question. But what this really shows is that it's their goal, it is their estimate, it is their prediction, it is their objective to ensure that you are paying more out of your own wealth, out of your own savings, out of your own income in taxes than you are today. They're putting this in black and white. This isn't my prediction. This isn't my assertion. They are telling us in black and white that when adjusted for inflation and adjusted for population, you will be paying more in taxes than you're paying today. And this is what they're telling us. And so you have to look at this as a rational person. And looking at this, I mean, they're putting this in black and white. They have published this document and are making this is all publicly available. And if you look at this, a rational person has to see this and say, this is not a consequence-free environment. This is not risk-free. And what can I do to mitigate these risks in a way that, that is low cost, that ensures that I can reduce my risk, and I can actually set myself up for some benefit. And again, there are a lot of these options and solutions out there. If you know that there are a lot of troubles in your banking system, that your central bank is nearly insolvent and your banking system is highly liquid, then you're not going to be worse off for moving some of your savings to a strong, stable bank overseas, where maybe the liquidity ratio is 20 times what your current bank is right now, and that the interest rate that they pay you overseas, even in a US dollar or euro, whatever bank account, is going to be 20, 30 times what you're receiving right now. It's hard to imagine that you're worse off for that. But again, if the worst happens, then you have a lot of benefit and you've mitigated that risk. It's hard to imagine that you're worse off if you set up, for example, one of these retirement structures and doing it properly, where the worst case is you've managed to save money, when considering that the average sort of IRA fee is about 1% of assets, whether you see that or not, and you can set up one of these structures, fix your costs, and essentially reduce your overall cost savings to even 0.5% or even less of your overall retirement assets. It's hard to imagine you're worse off because you're saving money and opening up new options to invest in, where you can actually make more money. And again, if the worst happens, your retirement savings can be easily shipped overseas in a place that they can't touch it. You've mitigated that risk in a way that sets you up for benefit with minimal cost. And so there are a lot of these kinds of solutions out there, and I'd really encourage folks to think in that direction. Look at the risks that are out there and find the solutions where you can sort of set yourself up for benefit while at the same time mitigating risk in a low-cost way. And there are a lot of these solutions out there. As I'm fond of saying, all the tools and all the resources already exist to do this. They already exist. It's just a question of education and taking action. We're very pleased to be a part of that. Very pleased to sort of continue to put this message out there. And again, this is all publicly available data. I would encourage you to look at these documents yourself and make your own decision about where you think the trend is going. So we'll cap it off from there. Appreciate your time and attention. I always enjoy doing these. Hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.